Imagine you are standing at the edge of a field that should not exist. It is somewhere around 4000 BC, on the broad alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates have spent 10,000 years depositing their gift of dark, silty soil across a landscape that was once marsh and shallow sea. The sun is just clearing the horizon, and already the air is warm, carrying the smell of wet earth, animal dung, and something sweet and green from the rows of barley that stretch in every direction. The rows are not perfectly straight. They have a handmade quality, slightly uneven, the work of people who have not been doing this for generations, but for centuries. Still learning, still adapting, still making catastrophic mistakes and surviving them. A man kneels at the base of a mud brick irrigation channel, using his forearm to push silt away from a narrow opening in the bank. The water seeps through, dark and slow, spreading into the root zone of the grain. He watches it for a moment, then stands and walks back toward a cluster of low rectangular structures on the horizon. He does not know that what he is doing will change everything. He is simply trying to feed his family. We are standing at one of the most consequential thresholds in human history, a period that archaeologists describe as the late Ubaid and early Uruk horizon, stretching roughly from 4,500 to 3,500 BC. This is the era immediately before writing, before the ziggurat, before the city-state in any form we would recognize. But it is not before civilization. The people of this era were building something vast and unprecedented, a world organized around the domestication of plants and animals, around the engineering of water, around the communal management of land. They were doing it without metal tools, without written records, without a single bureaucratic institution to coordinate their labor, and according to ancient traditions that would be written down only millennia later. This was also the age of the Nephilim, that strange and haunting passage in the book of Genesis, where the sons of God came to the daughters of men and produced offspring who are described as heroes of old, men of renown, mighty ones who walked the earth before the great flood changed everything. The book of Enoch, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls and revered in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, elaborates this tradition with extraordinary detail, claiming that divine beings called the Watchers descended to earth and taught humanity specific skills: how to work metal, how to read the stars, how to cultivate plants. Whether one reads these passages as literal history, as mythologized memory of a cultural revolution, or as something else entirely, they describe a world in transformation. A world where humanity was suddenly doing things it had never done before. Things that seemed, to later generations, almost supernatural in their ambition and effect. Agriculture was exactly that kind of transformation. When we talk about the domestication of plants and animals, as if it were a single event, a moment of invention, we are compressing something far messier and more gradual into a clean narrative it does not deserve. The actual process unfolded over thousands of years and involved not a single invention, but an accumulation of observations, failures, accidents, and adaptations too numerous to count. By 4000 BC, the communities of the Tigris-Euphrates basin had been working with domesticated grains for at least 3,000 years. Emmer wheat and einkorn had been brought under cultivation in the Fertile Crescent as early as 9000 BC, and barley had followed shortly after. But domestication is not a switch you flip. It is a relationship, and like all relationships, it changes both parties. The wild ancestors of wheat and barley had seed heads that shattered when ripe, dispersing their seeds efficiently in the wild. The domesticated varieties that ancient farmers selected, whether consciously or not, retained their seeds on the stalk, making them far easier to harvest, but entirely dependent on human beings to reproduce. By 4000 BC, the barley growing in those irrigated Mesopotamian fields could not spread without human hands. Wakos and the human communities tending those fields could not survive without the barley. A bond had formed that neither side could break. What that bond looked like on the ground was labor on a scale that is almost incomprehensible when you try to imagine it without machines. The preparation of a single field for planting required clearing, breaking, turning, and leveling soil that was often matted with roots, baked hard by the summer sun, or waterlogged from spring flooding. That archaeological evidence from Ubaid period sites like Eridu and Tel El Ubaid shows that the primary tool for this work was the flint-bladed hoe, a simple implement that transferred enormous physical strain directly to the shoulders, wrists, and lower back of whoever was using it. Skeletal remains from communities of this period show patterns of wear and degeneration in exactly these areas. The evidence of people who spent their working lives in postures that modern medicine would identify as chronically damaging. The body kept the record of the harvest long after the grain was gone. Irrigation made the difference between a harvest and starvation in this landscape. Southern Mesopotamia receives very little rainfall, rarely more than 200 millimeters per year, far below the threshold required for reliable dry farming. The rivers were everything. But the rivers were also unpredictable, flooding with catastrophic force in spring and retreating to sluggish channels in summer, often at precisely the wrong moments for growing crops. The communities of 4000 BC had already developed a sophisticated response to this challenge. They built canal systems that diverted river water into fields during the dry growing season, held it in shallow reservoirs, and released it through carefully managed sluices. The scale of some of these early irrigation networks, reconstructed from satellite imagery and archaeological survey, suggests collective labor involving hundreds of people working in coordinated effort across months and years. There was no central authority coordinating this in the way we imagine a state coordinating public works. It emerged from something more distributed, from the necessity of communities who understood that if the canal failed, everyone starved. The animals were as important as the plants, and their domestication was equally long and complicated. By 4000 BC, cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs had been living alongside human communities in Mesopotamia for thousands of years. But living alongside is not the same as fully domesticated in the modern sense. The cattle of this period were significantly larger and more dangerous than later breeds, and managing them required skills, infrastructure, and a willingness to absorb occasional catastrophic losses that we rarely pause to appreciate. Because goats and sheep were more tractable, and their importance to Ubaid period communities can be read in the archaeological record through the vast quantities of bones recovered at sites across the region. These animals provided not just meat, but milk, wool, hides, and traction. The plow, which appears in the archaeological record of Mesopotamia around 3500 BC, represents one of the most significant technological leaps of this era. And it was pulled by domesticated cattle, multiplying the area a single family could cultivate by an enormous factor. What did people actually eat in this world? The answer, reconstructed from carbonized seeds, animal bones, dental wear patterns, and chemical isotope analysis of human remains, is a diet that was both surprisingly rich and chronically precarious. Barley bread and barley porridge were the foundation, supplemented by lentils, chickpeas, onions, garlic, and leeks. Fish from the rivers and marshes provided essential protein and could be dried and stored for months. Dates from the tall palms that grew along the waterways were a crucial source of sugar and calories, and date wine was already being produced by this period. Dairy products, including yogurt like fermented milks, provided additional nutrition. Well, And isotope analysis of bones from Ubaid period sites confirms that animal protein from both meat and dairy was a regular, if not daily, component of the diet for at least some members of these communities. Beer, brewed from barley, was not merely a luxury. It was a safer alternative to unfiltered river water. Its fermentation process killing pathogens that would otherwise cause serious illness. But the precariousness was always there beneath the richness. A single bad flood, arriving too early or too late, could destroy an entire season's grain before it could be harvested. A drought that lowered river levels below the intake of irrigation canals could make planting impossible. Locusts, which archaeological and textual evidence confirms were a recurring catastrophe in this region throughout antiquity, could strip a field bare in hours. Grain stored in mud brick granaries was vulnerable to rodents, insects, and fungal contamination. The ancient world had no reserves in the modern sense, no global supply chains to draw on when local production failed. When the harvest was bad, people went hungry. When it was catastrophically bad, they died. Paleopathological studies of skeletal remains from this period show clear evidence of periodic nutritional stress in the form of enamel hypoplasia, disruptions in tooth development that occur during episodes of severe malnutrition in childhood. These marks are common enough in the archaeological record to suggest that crop failure and hunger were not occasional disasters, but recurring features of life. Into this world of fragile abundance, the Book of Enoch places the knowledge of agriculture as something the Watchers taught humanity, as if the complexity of coordinated farming could not be explained without a divine teacher. It is a fascinating tradition to sit with, not as literal history, but as cultural memory. The people who eventually wrote down these traditions were looking back at a world that had produced irrigation, domesticated animals, and coordinated grain storage and thinking. How did anyone figure this out? The explanation they reached was that it must have been taught by beings greater than ordinary humans. And when you stand in the shadow of what those early farming communities actually accomplished, with nothing but stone tools, collective labor, and the accumulated wisdom of generations, so it is not hard to understand why later people reached for the supernatural to explain it. The sites where this story unfolded still exist, buried under the desert and agricultural fields of modern Iraq and Iran. Eridu, considered the oldest city in the Sumerian king list, sits today as an eroded mound near the modern town of Abu Shahrain, its deepest levels dating to the Ubaid period. Tel el-Ubaid, which gave the entire cultural horizon its name, lies a few kilometers from the ancient city of Ur. If you could stand on the surface of these mounds and look down through the layers of compressed sediment, you would be looking through the accumulated waste, ash, and rebuilding of generations of farming communities who were slowly, collectively, working out how to feed themselves from a landscape that rewarded effort and punished error with equal impartiality. What connects their world to ours is not technology or scale, but the fundamental challenge they were wrestling with. How do you feed a growing population from a finite landscape without destroying the land that feeds you? They did not solve this problem. They managed it, generation by generation, with astonishing ingenuity and at enormous personal cost. The salinization of irrigated soil was already beginning by the late Ubaid period, a consequence of centuries of irrigation that would eventually help contribute to the decline of southern Mesopotamian agricultural productivity. They were mining their own future, not from greed, but from necessity, not knowing what we know now about soil chemistry and long-term land management. That tension between what the land needs and what hungry communities demand of it is one they handed to us. We have not resolved it either. The world of 4000 BC was not the world of giants in the literal sense that ancient texts sometimes suggest. But it was, in its own way, a world of enormous undertaking, of human communities attempting something that had never been done at that scale before. Bending the biological world to their survival through a combination of observation, adaptation, and brutal collective labor. Whether or not beings of divine origin walked among them, the people of this era were themselves doing something that must have seemed, to their own descendants, almost miraculous. They were feeding the future. If there is another era or another lost world you would like to explore together, I am always ready to step back into the dust and see what we can find.